The title of longest reigning president in the history of the United States of America belongs to none other than Franklin D. Roosevelt, who served a total of 4 terms, starting his first term on March 4th, 1933, and remaining president until his passing on April 12th, 1945. Having one president for 12 consecutive years may seem like a lot, well technically it was 12 years and just over a month, and that's because it is. Still to this day, some countries don't necessarily put a limit on how long someone can be in charge of a country. A great example of this is Canada, where although technically there's a limit of years per term, technically speaking, if the prime minister in charge keeps winning the elections, they'll stay in office until they lose or die. The US is different, as the president gets a max of 2 terms or 8 years. But what if President Trump found a way to change that? Today on Life's Biggest Questions, we're asking what if Donald Trump was president for 20 years? What's happening, guys? Welcome back to LBQ. I'm your host, Jared Bronstein, and today we got a very interesting question. We know how the election played out, but who knows how things will actually play out? Either way, stick around to the very end of this one for some bonus content and click that playlist button for some similar content, but for now, guys, let's get into it. As we know, in the United States, the 22nd Amendment states, and I quote, "No person shall be elected to the office of the president more than twice, and no person who has held the office of president or acted as president for more than 2 years of a term to which some other person was elected president shall be elected to the office of the president more than once." In simple terms, you can only be president for a max of 8 years or 2 terms. However, the 22nd Amendment was introduced after the sudden death of Roosevelt, who just a month into his 4th term would die of a brain hemorrhage or stroke. However, prior to Roosevelt, all other presidents served 2 terms or less, simply because after George Washington served his 2 terms, he released a memoir proclaiming he did all he felt he could for his country and it was time for another man to take over. That next man would be John Adams, who after serving for 4 years would lose the next election to Thomas Jefferson. Jefferson would then serve for 2 terms after winning consecutive elections, but would step down after his 8th year as president, proclaiming that 2 terms was more than enough for one man and feared anything more could overextend executive power. The 2 terms then became the unofficial standard until the 22nd Amendment was passed. But surprisingly, only Roosevelt lasted more than 2 terms, even before the amendment, and that's because former presidents who tried to get nominated a 3rd time around just didn't win. So how did Frankie do it? It was all about circumstance. Just a few years removed from the Great Depression, Roosevelt took office on the heels of a country who was trying to stabilize once again. Clearly he did a good enough job that the American citizens decided to vote him in office once again, which takes us to 1936 when he got re-elected, winning more than 2/3 of the popular vote. The country was also about to enter a second world war, and although no one could predict the future, during a time in which the country could potentially be going to war, the last thing you want is political unrest in your own country as well as a transition of power. With the war breaking out in 1939, although the US wasn't involved just yet, Roosevelt was still in charge, and with the presidential election taking place in 1940, he realized it was likely in his country's best interest to keep things amicable with what's happening in Europe. With this in mind, he decided to run again and won by a landslide. Although there had been no president to serve more than 2 terms, as Barbara Perry, professor and director of presidential studies at the University of Virginia's Miller Center, well, she explained, and I quote, "There was nothing but precedent standing in his way. But still, precedent, especially as it relates to the presidency, can be pretty powerful." In regards to his 4th term, while the country was still involved in the Second World War, officially declaring war in 1941, Roosevelt made it clear he had every intention of running again, even though his health was significantly declining. Still, given what he had been doing for the country for the past 12 years, it seems Roosevelt had tons of support, and won his 4th term fairly comfortably. That being said, he would only serve for a few months during his final term as president, as he would pass away in April of 1945 from what is believed to have been a stroke or brain hemorrhaging, as I said before. Following Roosevelt's passing, there was a common fear that if there weren't limits on how many terms a president could run for office, it may lead to presidential tyranny. And given Roosevelt's decline in health and the fact that no one expected him to make all 4 years in office during his 4th term, it seems the 22nd Amendment was passed, ensuring moving forward, no one could be president for more than 8 consecutive years. Still, Harry Truman, who was Roosevelt's vice president and successor to FDR, tried going for a 3rd term but pulled out after losing the New Hampshire primary. Because he was in office while the amendment passed, he was allowed to run for a 3rd term. Ever since, everyone has been limited to just 2. So what happens if somehow, someway President Trump was the man in charge of the US for 20 years? Well, either the country would be going through it, or he would have changed the laws, more specifically the Constitution's 22nd Amendment, which would allow him to be elected president more than twice. Either way, as you can imagine, it likely wouldn't be a good look for the country, assuming things are so bad for whatever reason that the citizens or the government feels they need President Trump to remain in office. Or, on the flip side, he somehow was able to change the law, which was ratified in 1951. In 2018, China's Communist Party said they'd be getting rid of presidential term limits, which many US media outlets claimed was a dangerous decision. The most obvious fear is the president in charge, currently Xi Jinping, finds a way to continue ruling as the country's president, and even if he loses the election, still finds a way to remain in charge. This is the whole thing with the fear of a tyrannical leader or president, which is why they introduced the 22nd Amendment in the first place. And if history tells us anything, what would happen should President Trump remain in office for 20 years would play out depending on how he ran the country while in office. The Washington Post broke down how things could play out into 3 different scenarios. Either Trump would eventually step down and retire, he would rule for the rest of his life, or he would be kicked out against his own will, so pretty much a revolution against the government, or at the very least, the President of the United States of America. Sounds like a scary time, but as history shows, for the most part, it seems those in charge for prolonged periods of time eventually step down, especially if the citizens are against them. Otherwise, they need to face the hammer. As per the Washington Post, citing data from Alexander Baturo, an academic at Dublin City University who studies term limits, he went on to say, and I quote, "Looking at 47 world leaders who extended their time in office during the period between 1960 and 2010, he found that only 8 had died in office, while 13 had stepped down and retired, and 3 had lost re-elections. More than half of the total number, however, had been violently ousted from office, 18, or assassinated, 5. Now, I'm not too sure how Trump would be able to pull this off. The only realistic way that I could possibly think of is that the country is in such shambles, potentially from a war with a very powerful country, that the Supreme Court lends way to either postpone the election altogether or allows for the president in charge to run again simply because of the unprecedented times. However, by this point, it is entirely possible Donald Trump tries to pass laws or find ways to ensure that he can continue his reign in office even after the catastrophic event that would most likely have to take place for this to even be a possibility in the first place. However, at some point, the people of the good old US of A would be fed up and eventually would want a new leader. Whether that would mean President Trump, after 20 years, would be willing to do a peaceful transition of power, or if the citizens would literally need to take their country back, would need to be determined. Statistically speaking, it seems if Trump would refuse to step down from being the leader of the country, he would either be violently ousted from office, or worse, assassinated. Now, given the fact that Trump is currently 74 and has served 4 years in office, by the time he'd reach the 2-decade mark, the man would be in his 90s. I don't think many people would want to violently oust a 90-year-old man, nor would they necessarily need to. It seems more likely than not, if Trump were able to somehow pull this off, much like North Korea, the political system would go from an election to whoever is next in line takes over. An heir to the throne, if you will. Given that Trump has his family aiding him in regards to his administration, it would make the most sense that if Trump was somehow able to stay in office for 20 years, by the time he was on his way out, either in regards to presidency or life in general, he would want one of his children to take over. First in line would be none other than Donald Trump Jr., which, funny enough, is really starting to make me realize how much like North Korea the United States would start to resemble, which is some pretty scary stuff. Now again, this is all under the assumption that President Trump finds a way to change laws that have been in place now for about 70 years. It would also mean that the American people either voted him in for more than 2 consecutive terms, or as his second term came to an end, he found a way to stay in power. And when all this was going on, the citizens just let it happen without any sort of pushback or civil unrest. Of course, as we've seen this year, when the citizens fight force with force, 99.9 times out of 10 they're going to lose. But with that being said, it seems the country is quite divided currently. If it came down to all the American people against the government, although the government would have stronger weapons, there usually is strength in numbers, and it's possible there is a revolution. But hey, we don't have to worry about any of this now because, well, regardless of how the election plays out and who officially wins, even if Trump is able to pull it off again, this would only be his second term. Come back to this video in 4 years and we'll see how close I was to the mark. Now, as always, guys, let us know your thoughts on all this down below. If Trump was in charge for 20 years, do you think the US would stay a democracy, or would it be all-out tyrannical reign? Let me know. For now, let's do some comment replies from the video. What if Donald Trump fought Joe Biden? Who would win? Dabby said, to be fair, Trump wrestled on WWE, so he would have an edge. Yeah, I thought we included that. If we didn't, producer Chris here told us, you know, there was that match against Vince McMahon when he shaved his head. So I think, look guys, I was the one saying Trump would win. He's got a bunch of UFC fighters that support him. He was in the WWE at one point. I mean, Joe Biden's just a politician, so that's all, you know, what can he do? Finesse with Jess said, wait, but what's this? My God, it's Bernie Sanders with a steel chair. Where's King to, you know, puppies? If you watch WWE, you know exactly what I'm talking about. I just think really they would have to either do a buried alive match, because if they fight, you know, odds are, I'm just, like, buried alive is really the only way to go, right? They're old, man. If they fought, then someone would die. Something said, it will be awesome if all the past presidents came back to life to watch it. I think, to me, the cooler thing would be dead people coming back to life. That would be the bigger deal. But maybe they would just all, like, it'd be like a zombie thing where they all just cheer on who they want and then they'd all go back to the grave. I don't know. It'd be cool, though. Anyways, guys, that's all for this one. I've been your host, Jared Bronstein. Let me know your thoughts on this one in the comments down below, and we'll see you soon. Didn't forget, though, I still love you.